The flickering neon light of the roadside diner cast long, distorted shadows across the checkered linoleum floor. It was meant to be a simple stop, a brief respite from the relentless chill of the midnight highway. But as Rowan Voss stepped through the heavy glass doors, his service dog, Dagger, froze. The Belgian Malinois, a veteran of unseen wars, planted his paws with a sudden, rigid finality. Across the room, a solitary woman sat motionless before a mug of coffee that had long since grown cold. When she slowly extended a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against the cold, worn metal of Dagger's military-issue collar, the air in the diner seemed to evaporate. Rowan, guided only by the fragmented echoes of his damaged hearing and the fading shapes in his limited vision, caught the sharp, ragged intake of her breath. Then she spoke. It was a single shattered whisper, but it carried the undeniable weight of a past they had both tried to bury. Rowan recognized that voice. It was the voice of the woman who had lived for years in silence, hoarding the agonizing truth of a betrayal that had cost Dagger his handler and nearly cost Rowan his life. But what the dog did next shocked everyone. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe to Kindness and K9 Legends. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The diner smelled of ancient grease, scorched coffee, and the quiet desperation of 3 in the morning. For Rowan Voss, the visual world was a permanent twilight, a smeared canvas of muted grays and hazy silhouettes that shifted unpredictably at the edges of his ruined sight. He relied on the geography of sound and the topography of touch. The relentless hum of the commercial refrigerator near the counter vibrated through the worn soles of his boots, a low, rhythmic thumping that battled against the high-pitched, electric buzz of a failing overhead fluorescent tube. The ambient noise was a chaotic assault on his damaged eardrums, each sound carrying a painful, metallic echo, yet he filtered the chaos with practiced precision. His left hand, draped in a worn leather glove, held the sturdy leash with a familiar, desperate grip. Without realizing it, his knuckles began to press against the heavy leather, turning a stark, bloodless white as the familiar tightness coiled in his chest. His breathing grew shallow, restricted to the upper arches of his lungs, his body automatically anticipating a threat in the confined, unfamiliar space. At the end of the leash, Dagger moved with the deliberate, silent grace of a ghost. The Belgian Malinois usually glided through civilian spaces with a practiced indifference, his body a tight spring of disciplined energy, always favoring his left side, shielding the deep, jagged scar that ran along his flank. His claws clicked rhythmically against the peeling linoleum, a metronome of steady companionship. But halfway down the narrow aisle separating the vinyl booths, the metronome stopped. There was no growl, no warning bark, just a sudden, absolute stillness. The abrupt lack of forward momentum jerked Rowan's arm. The slack in the leather leash pulled taut. Rowan stopped instantly. The air shifting around Dagger's body changed. The coarse fur along the ridge of the dog's spine spiked straight up, rigid as wire. Dagger's weight shifted entirely to his hind legs, dropping his center of gravity into a tactical stance. He leaned heavily against the left side of a nearby booth, pressing his scarred flank into the solid wood as if securing his perimeter. His dark muzzle pointed slightly downward, a low, barely audible vibration beginning to form deep within his chest cavity. Not quite a growl, but the physical manifestation of trapped air and pure instinct. Rowan felt the vibration travel up the leather strap and into his wrist. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing painfully against the collar of his jacket. He tilted his head, attempting to angle his deaf ear away, focusing his remaining sensory bandwidth on the space directly in front of them. The warmth of a floor-heating vent blew across his face, but beneath the heavy aroma of fried food, another scent lingered. It was faint, almost imperceptible to a civilian nose. The dry, brittle scent of old, damp paper and stale printer ink. A sterile, bureaucratic scent that did not belong in a roadside diner. A woman was sitting in the corner booth. She was entirely still, save for the rhythmic, unconscious tapping of her index finger against the side of a cold porcelain mug. Tap, tap, pause, tap. The cadence was too structured, too deliberate to be a nervous twitch. It was a rhythm born of ingrained muscle memory, the unmistakable staccato of military communication code. Rowan's jaw clenched, the muscles along his cheekbones standing out in stark relief. The air in the diner grew thick, pressing down heavily on his lungs. The past was sitting at the table, and Dagger had found it. The space between Dagger's front paw, lifting from the cracked linoleum and striking it again, seemed to stretch into eternity. Time, within the narrow confines of the diner aisle, dilated into a slow, agonizing crawl. The heavy leather leash slithered a fraction of an inch across Rowan's calloused palm, the friction communicating a profound volume of information that his damaged eyes could no longer provide. Dagger was not lunging. He was not initiating a tactical takedown sequence. He was tracking an invisible thread, pulled forward by an irresistible, ghostly gravity. The ambient noise of the midnight world, the rattling hum of the commercial refrigerator, the distant, mournful rumble of a passing 18-wheeler on the highway faded into a hollow, pressurized vacuum in Rowan's ears. He focused his entire consciousness on the kinetic feedback vibrating through the taut leather strap. He felt the precise moment Dagger's weight shifted, dropping into a low, cautious, and deliberate stalk. At the corner booth, the woman remained an absolute monument of stillness. Her faded olive-drab trench coat hung loosely over narrow, rigid shoulders, the collar turned up sharp and high, hiding the nape of her neck. The rhythmic tapping of her index finger against the mug had abruptly ceased. The sudden, absolute absence of that structured, military cadence was louder and far more alarming than a siren echoing in Rowan's deafened ear. It was the silence of a held breath. The silence of sudden, shocking recognition. Dagger closed the final, excruciating distance. His dark, velvet muzzle hovered mere inches from the chipped edge of the formica table. The sterile, bureaucratic scent of old, damp archival paper and stale printer ink was overwhelming now, violently clashing with the heavy aroma of fried grease. The massive Belgian Malinois did not sniff the air with frantic curiosity. Instead, he stood entirely rigid, his powerful chest expanded with one slow, deliberate intake of breath. The air hissed faintly through his nostrils. He was actively cataloging a scent profile that belonged to a closed, highly classified chapter of a past life. Then, the woman moved. It was a glacial, agonizing shift, a slow rotation of her wrist. Her hand, which had been wrapped tightly around the cold, unforgiving porcelain of the neglected coffee mug, slowly uncurled. The skin stretched over her knuckles was incredibly thin, papery, and mapped with a complex network of pale blue veins. Her fingers trembled. It was not the frantic, chaotic shaking of the winter chill. It was the deep, seismic vibration of a human being physically struggling to hold back a tidal wave of suppressed panic and profound, crushing grief. Slowly, she extended her empty hand outward over the chipped formica table, reaching into the narrow aisle. She was reaching toward the massive, scarred K9 standing like a coiled spring in the harsh, flickering, fluorescent light. Rowan's heart slammed violently against his ribs. He felt the exact microsecond Dagger's defensive posture hit its absolute peak threshold. The coarse fur along the dog's spine remained standing stiff as wire. The thick muscles in Dagger's hind legs bunched, ready to explode backward or launch forward into a violent defense. The trembling fingers bridged the final empty inches of air. They drifted toward the heavy, military-issue nylon webbing secured around Dagger's thick neck. Rowan stopped breathing. His jaw locked. The diner went entirely, completely dead. The space between the woman's trembling fingertips and the thick, tactical nylon of Dagger's collar dissolved millimeter by agonizing millimeter. For Rowan Voss, plunged in his world of hazy shadows and muffled echoes, the impending collision was not visual, but entirely tactile. It manifested as a searing, electric tension screaming up the length of the worn leather leash. The leather was pulled so incredibly taut it felt like a steel cable about to snap under the immense pressure of a suspended bridge. Rowan's left hand, encased in the battered leather glove, turned entirely numb as he gripped the loop with crushing force. His thumb pressed into his index finger, the joints locking, his forearm muscles burning with the effort to hold a mountain that was teetering on the edge of a landslide. Skin met nylon. The contact was made. It was a whisper of a touch, impossibly light, yet the impact registered through the diner like a seismic shockwave. The woman's pale, papery fingers brushed against the rugged olive-drab webbing that encircled the massive Belgian Malinois' neck. Her fingertips slid slightly, grazing the cold heavy metal of the steel D-ring and the jagged, worn edges of the military identification tags resting against his chest. Dagger's response was immediate and visceral. The thick muscles across his broad chest seized. His front paws, planted firmly on the cracked linoleum, did not move forward, but the heavy, dark claws unsheathed, scraping a harsh, agonizing line against the floorboards as his body braced for impact. The coarse fur along the ridge of his spine, already standing at attention, seemed to bristle even further, turning the ridge of his back into a serrated blade. A low, vibrating hum, heavy with trapped air and pure, unfiltered instinct, rattled deep within his ribcage. It was the physical manifestation of a tactical unit preparing to detonate. Rowan felt the vibration instantly. It traveled up the leash, bypassed his damaged ears, and hummed directly in the marrow of his wrist bones. He braced his boots against the floor, his jaw clamped shut so tightly his teeth ached. He prepared for the lunge. He prepared for the chaotic explosion of a defensive strike. He waited for the snapping of jaws and the violent twist of the leash. But the lunge never came. The explosion was aborted. Dagger's massive head lowered a fraction of an inch. His dark, intelligent eyes remained locked on the woman's hand, but the rigid, aggressive angle of his jaw began to soften. The dog's sensitive olfactory receptors were flooded with data. Beneath the sterile scent of old archival paper and the overwhelming odor of burnt diner coffee, there was something else. There was the heavy, unmistakable scent of salt, tears that had dried long ago, the sharp, sour tang of chronic adrenaline exhaustion, and the profound, hollow scent of a human being who was entirely, irreparably shattered. The Belgian Malinois, bred for combat and scarred by betrayal, recognized the lack of a predator. He recognized the fragile, crumbling structure of the entity sitting before him. The sharp, tactical vibration in his chest slowly died down, dissolving into a heavy, raspy exhalation that blew hot air across the woman's freezing knuckles. Dagger did not lean into the touch, retaining his rigid, defensive posture against the booth, but he did not pull away. He stood perfectly still, allowing the ghost from his past to anchor her trembling fingers to the worn metal of his collar. Rowan stood frozen in the aisle, the sweat cooling on the back of his neck. The unbearable tension in the leash shifted, turning from the sharp pull of an impending attack into the heavy, grounded weight of a dog standing at attention. The silence in the diner stretched out, thick and suffocating, waiting to be broken. The ambient, electrical drone of the diner seemed to evaporate, sucked into the vacuum of the space between the corner booth and the scarred Belgian Malinois. For an agonizing stretch of seconds, the only movement was the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of Dagger's ribcage against the worn leather of his harness. The woman's hand remained anchored to the heavy metal D-ring of the collar, her thin, papery fingers absorbing the immense, suppressed energy radiating from the dog's powerful frame. Then, her lips parted. The sound that emerged was barely more than the friction of air against dry, damaged vocal cords. It was a fractured, hollow vibration, stripped of all strength. Yet it cut through the thick, grease-laden atmosphere of the room with the precision of a scalpel. I thought they had destroyed everything. Rowan's entire musculoskeletal system locked. The heavy leather leash, which had momentarily relaxed its unbearable tension, was suddenly crushed within his left grip. The worn seams of his leather glove groaned under the immense, unyielding pressure. His knuckles turned entirely white, the joints popping softly in the quiet aisle. The air in his lungs turned to concrete. He could not exhale. He could not draw a new breath. For Rowan Voss, navigating a world draped in permanent, hazy twilight, voices were not just sounds. They were complex, three-dimensional architectures. They were auditory fingerprints, carrying the exact weight, texture, and history of the souls who possessed them. And this voice, this specific, hoarse, fractured timbre, was an architecture he had spent years trying to burn to the ground. It was the voice. It was not the words she spoke, but the underlying frequency of her vocal cords. It was the distinct, raspy edge of a throat ruined by endless pots of military-grade coffee and years of swallowing down unspoken horrors. Rowan's damaged ears did not hear a frail woman sitting in a roadside diner at 3 a.m. He heard the chaotic, deafening roar of a sandstorm beating against the reinforced metal of a command vehicle. He heard the terrifying, electronic crackle of a tactical headset. He heard the high-pitched whine of radio interference. He heard this exact voice, cutting through the heavy static of a secure channel, repeating a sequence of coordinates that led a K9 team directly into a trap. His jaw bared down, the muscles along his neck corded tightly, pulling the skin taut over his collarbone. A single bead of cold sweat formed at his temple, tracking a slow, agonizing path down his cheek. The phantom smell of burning ozone and pulverized stone rushed into his sinuses, entirely suffocating the diner's scent of fried food. Down at the end of the leash, Dagger instantly registered the violent, physiological spike in his handler. The dog's ears, which had relaxed slightly, snapped back flat against his skull. The coarse hair along his spine bristled anew. Dagger did not break contact with the woman's hand, but his powerful chest shifted backward, throwing his weight heavily against Rowan's boots, creating a physical barrier of muscle and bone between the blind veteran and the source of the auditory trigger. The dog felt the tremor traveling down the leash, a violent, uncontrollable shaking radiating from Rowan's wrist. Rowan swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing painfully against a dry throat. He forced his rigid neck to turn slightly, angling his face toward the shape-shifting in the corner booth. The ghost had a voice, and the ghost had finally spoken. Rowan Voss did not speak. His throat, constricted by a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline, entirely refused to form words. The distance between his position in the narrow aisle and the worn vinyl seat of the corner booth was a matter of only 3 steps, but the act of moving forward felt like wading through a swamp of wet, curing concrete. He moved blindly, his heavy boots scuffing the peeling linoleum. Dagger moved with him, a dense, silent shadow anchored firmly to Rowan's left leg. The Belgian Malinois did not break his intense, unyielding focus on the woman, his dark eyes tracking every minuscule shift of her thin, fragile shoulders. As Rowan slid into the booth opposite the ghost from his past, the cracked vinyl groaned beneath his weight. It was a harsh, abrasive squeak, a friction that grated aggressively against his highly sensitive, damaged auditory nerves. The physical space instantly shrank. The invisible walls of the corner booth seemed to violently press inward, creating a suffocatingly claustrophobic vacuum. Rowan's chest locked. His breathing automatically shifted, turning into incredibly shallow, rapid, and ragged intakes of air that barely scraped the upper arches of his lungs. The heavy, grease-laden oxygen of the diner suddenly felt too thick to inhale. His left hand, still encased in the battered leather glove, dropped heavily to his thigh beneath the table. His fingers curled inward, the thick leather creaking as he formed a fist so incredibly tight that the muscles in his forearm began to tremble with the sheer force of it. Across the chipped formica table, the woman remained entirely frozen. The harsh, failing fluorescent light above them cast long, unnatural shadows, illuminating the deep, hollow valleys beneath her cheekbones and the dark, bruised purple skin pooling under her eyes. She looked like a monument carved from exhaustion and chronic, unending fear. No one moved. No one breathed. The air between them grew impossibly dense, laden with the heavy, unacknowledged weight of a disastrous night buried deeply in the past. Beneath the small, cramped table, Dagger maneuvered his massive frame into the narrow space. He deliberately wedged himself beneath the formica, pressing the entire length of his scarred left flank firmly against Rowan's shin. The dog's intense, radiating body heat seeped through the thick denim of Rowan's jeans. It was a solid, undeniable, and grounding anchor in a room that suddenly felt entirely untethered from reality. Dagger did not whine. He did not seek affection. He simply positioned himself as a tactical, living shield between his handler and the perceived source of immense psychological trauma. Slowly, agonizingly, the woman pulled her papery, trembling hand back from the empty air where Dagger's collar had been. Her fingers curled inward, pulling the lapels of her faded, olive-drab trench coat tighter around her sunken chest. Rowan kept his face angled slightly away, utilizing the hazy periphery of his damaged vision to track the blurred outline of her silhouette. His jaw remained clamped shut. He sat in the crushing silence of the corner booth, waiting for the fragile porcelain of the moment to finally shatter. The silence that followed her initial fractured whisper was not empty. It was a dense, living organism, swelling to fill every available cubic inch of the cramped corner booth. It pressed against Rowan's eardrums, a heavy, atmospheric pressure that threatened to crush the fragile bones within his damaged ears. He did not move a single muscle. He anchored his entire physical being to the intense, radiating heat of the Belgian Malinois wedged firmly against his shin, using Dagger's steady, rhythmic breathing as a metronome to regulate his own failing respiratory system. When the woman finally spoke again, she did not look at him. She stared down at the chipped formica table, her voice scraping against the heavy air. "People think a disaster is loud," she whispered, the words lacking any resonance, crumbling into the space between them like dry ash. "They think it is chaos, shouting, the roar of a collapsed structure." But that night, the true horror was the absolute dead air. Rowan's left hand, hidden beneath the table, tightened its death grip on his own thigh. The worn leather glove groaned in protest. His thumb dug viciously into the side of his index finger, a sharp, grounding pain designed to keep his mind tethered to the physical world, stopping it from being sucked backward into the traumatic vortex of his memory. He knew exactly what dead air sounded like. It was the terrifying, hollow void that followed the sudden termination of a lifeline. "I was on the main console," she continued, her breathing shallow, her words spaced far apart, as if each syllable required a monumental exertion of physical strength. "I had the secure channel locked. I heard your handler. I heard him call the abort sequence. I heard the exact moment he realized the extraction coordinates were a fatal funnel. He requested immediate exfiltration." Beneath the table, Dagger's heavy head snapped up. The thick muscles in his neck corded tight. He did not possess human vocabulary, but he possessed an ancient, flawless instinct for the catastrophic shifts in human emotional frequency. The scent of profound, agonizing guilt began to roll off the woman in heavy, suffocating waves, masking the lingering odor of stale diner coffee. Dagger shifted his weight, his sharp claws scraping a harsh, agonizing inch across the linoleum, pressing his scarred left flank even harder against Rowan's leg. The dog's body was a rigid block of pure tension, absorbing the invisible shock waves radiating from the fragile figure across the table. "I had my finger on the transmit button," she breathed out, the sound hitching violently in her ruined throat. "I had the override code ready to send. I could have pulled you out." She stopped. A violent tremor seized her narrow shoulders. Her pale, papery hands moved to the table, her thin fingers pressing flat against the formica, as if trying to push the physical memory away. But the commanding officer entered the communication hub. She whispered, her voice dropping into a register of pure, unfiltered devastation. He did not shout. He did not explain. He simply reached over, and he severed the connection. He physically broke the line. Rowan's chest seized. The air trapped in his lungs turned to poison. The muscles along his jawline bulged, hard and unforgiving as carved granite. And then, she choked out, her voice finally breaking, shattering into a million jagged pieces of suppressed agony. He gave the final directive: scrub the communication logs, erase the digital footprint, purge the entire transmission history for that 30-minute window. We were ordered to manufacture a technological blackout. We were ordered to make it look as though your handler never called for help. We buried the truth beneath a mountain of bureaucratic red tape, and we let them build a false narrative. The revelation did not hit Rowan with the force of an explosion. It seeped into his bones like a slow-acting, freezing venom. The crushing weight of a systemic failure, the deliberate administrative betrayal of veterans who had sacrificed their blood and sanity, settled over him like a burial shroud. It was not a chaotic battlefield mistake. It was a cold, calculated erasure of their service and their rights. The ghost had not just spoken. She had handed him the blueprint of his own destruction. The confession hung in the stifling, grease-heavy air of the diner. It was a suffocating blanket woven from years of systemic deceit, suffocating the last remaining oxygen in the cramped corner booth. The woman's gaze, previously locked in a vacant stare across the formica table, finally fell. It drifted downward, devoid of any focus, a physical surrender to the massive weight of her own admission. Her eyes slipped past the chipped edge of the tabletop. They bypassed the heavy, rigid nylon of the military-issue leash clamped in Rowan's white-knuckled grip. Her gaze landed in the shadows beneath the table. It landed on the dog's left flank. Time, which had already been crawling at an agonizing pace, abruptly stopped entirely. Dagger was wedged tightly beneath the booth, his massive frame serving as a living, breathing barrier. The harsh, erratic flickering of the neon light outside the window cast a narrow, pale beam across the peeling linoleum floor. The cold light spilled over the rigid, muscular architecture of the Belgian Malinois, casting a stark, unforgiving highlight across the deep, hairless canyon of tissue that marred his left side. The scar was not a clean, surgical incision. It was a chaotic, jagged map of brutal survival, an erratic line of raised, pale flesh that violently broke the smooth, dark perfection of his coat. The woman's chest ceased to rise. The shallow, rapid rhythm of her breathing abruptly terminated. The papery, translucent skin around her eyes stretched incredibly taut, pulling the corners of her eyelids back in a sudden, violent expression of pure, unadulterated shock. The network of pale blue veins at her temples began to pulse frantically, a visible manifestation of her heart slamming against her fragile ribcage. Her pupils dilated massively, swallowing the pale color of her irises until her eyes were nothing but dark, bottomless wells reflecting the harsh overhead light. She knew that mark. She had not been in the dirt that night. She had not smelled the burning sand or felt the concussive shockwave of the ambush. But she had been the archivist of the tragedy. She had meticulously processed the classified after-action reports. She had read the emergency veterinary triage files, memorizing the devastating extent of the trauma before the commanding officer had ordered the entire digital footprint permanently incinerated. She knew the precise entry point of the damage. She knew the exact angle of the tearing wound that had nearly ended a heroic canine's life. Her lips parted, her jaw dropped open, the joints clicking softly in the agonizing silence. No sound emerged. It was a silent, catastrophic fracture of the human spirit. The faded olive-drab trenchcoat heaved violently as her narrow chest collapsed entirely inward. Her trembling hands flew up from the formica surface, her thin fingers pressing desperately against her own mouth as if trying to physically trap the sheer, suffocating volume of grief welling up from her hollow core. She wept without a single tear. It was a dry, violently physical shaking. Her fragile shoulders convulsed in a rapid, uncontrollable rhythm of pure, unfiltered devastation. Rowan felt the atmospheric pressure in the booth violently shift. The sudden, shocking absence of her raspy voice was instantly replaced by the erratic, broken hitching of a suppressed, agonizing physical collapse. He tilted his head, his ruined ears straining to decode the frequency of her crumbling composure. The muscles in his neck corded tight like steel cables. Beneath the table, Dagger's physical state underwent a massive, instantaneous transformation. The coarse hair along the ridge of his spine immediately laid flat. The low, deep, defensive vibration trapped within his broad chest ceased entirely. The dog's hypersensitive olfactory glands were entirely overwhelmed by the sudden, massive spike of cortisol and the sharp, sour scent of a human being experiencing a total psychological breakdown. Dagger shifted his heavy weight. His claws clicked softly against the linoleum as he rotated his massive frame, instinctually turning his scarred flank slightly away from the woman's intense, horrified gaze to protect his most vulnerable geography. Yet, the Belgian Malinois did not retreat from the space. Instead, he pressed the solid, heavy line of his dark jaw firmly onto Rowan's denim-clad knee. It was a heavy, grounding anchor of solid bone and dense muscle, a living tether designed to keep his blind handler from being entirely swept away in the turbulent, suffocating sea of the woman's emotional collapse. The violent, physical shuddering of the fragile figure across the table finally began to subside, leaving behind a hollow, desperate, gasping rhythm. The woman dragged a trembling hand down her pallid face, her thin skin pulling tight over her sharp cheekbones. Her wide, dilated gaze remained anchored to the heavy shadows beneath the formica tabletop, locked entirely onto the raised, pale scar tissue marking the Belgian Malinois. "He survived," she whispered. It was not a question. It was a fractured, hollow statement of absolute disbelief. "They said no one made it out of the kill zone intact." Her voice shook, the words scraping against her dry throat. "They filed the after-action report. They classified the K9 asset as..." She could not finish the sentence. The cold, sterile, bureaucratic terminology died on her tongue, entirely inadequate for the immense, breathing reality sitting just inches from her boots. Rowan Voss did not confirm or deny her statement. His left hand slowly uncurled from the agonizing death grip on his own thigh. His thick, calloused fingers dropped heavily, grazing the coarse, bristling hair between Dagger's ears. The massive dog instantly leaned upward into the touch, pushing his solid, broad skull against the palm of the battered leather glove. It was a heavy, grounding weight of pure, unfiltered loyalty, in a room drowning in deceit. "The official inquiry," the woman continued, her voice suddenly gaining a desperate, frantic edge, stated that the ambush was completely unforeseen. "They testified that field intelligence failed. They swore under oath that your forward operating unit pushed too far ahead of the armored support column, breaking protocol." She leaned forward, her narrow chest pressed hard against the chipped edge of the diner table. The worn vinyl of the booth squeaked sharply beneath her shifting weight. It was a lie. All of it. Rowan's jaw clenched. The muscles along his neck stood out like thick steel cables. "The emergency extraction order," she breathed out, her chest heaving as she finally forced her eyes upward, trying to pierce the hazy, shadowed veil of Rowan's limited vision. It was not just ignored in the chaos of battle. It was actively, deliberately suppressed. The commanding officer standing in that communication hub had the precise withdrawal coordinates in his hand 10 minutes before the enemy perimeter collapsed. 10 minutes. The words struck Rowan's damaged eardrums with the devastating, concussive force of a physical detonation. A high-pitched, metallic ringing violently flared in his auditory canals, threatening to drown out the relentless hum of the diner's failing refrigerator. 10 minutes was an absolute eternity in the suffocating dust of a firefight. 10 minutes was the monumental difference between a coordinated tactical retreat and a blind, chaotic slaughter. 10 minutes meant his K9 brother, the handler who had trained Dagger, did not have to bleed his life out into the foreign sand. Why? It was a single, ragged word. It was a low, dangerous gravel, torn from the very bottom of Rowan's scarred throat. It was the very first sound he had made since stepping out of the freezing highway wind. The woman flinched violently at the sheer, suppressed gravity of his voice. She swallowed hard, her papery hands twisting the fabric of her olive-drab trench coat. "Because of the payload," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the empty diner counter before locking back onto Rowan. "The target structure your team was sent in to clear. It held unsanctioned ordnance, highly classified weapons that belonged to our own black-budget operations, weapons that had been quietly sold through illicit back channels. If your unit had successfully secured that building and reported the massive cache up the standard chain of command, the entire illegal network, reaching to the very top of the sector command, would have been immediately exposed." The missing link clicked into place. It slammed into Rowan's chest, stealing the remaining oxygen from his lungs. The catastrophic failure of that night was not born of battlefield panic. It was not born of tragic incompetence. It was a meticulously planned execution. His team was sent deep into the hostile compound specifically to trigger the massive ambush, to be entirely wiped off the map before they could ever discover the damning truth hidden within those walls. The commanding officer had physically severed the communication line to ensure the permanent silence of the dead. And when Rowan had miraculously, impossibly survived the impossible odds, dragging his broken body and the bleeding K9 from the wreckage, they had realized their execution had failed. So, they pinned the monumental catastrophe squarely on his battered shoulders. They framed his desperate, agonizing fight for survival as a tactical dereliction of duty, court-martialing him to entirely discredit any wild testimony he might offer about a delay in support. They had not just stolen his sight, his hearing, and his brother's. They had stolen his honor to protect their greed. Beneath the table, Dagger let out a low, rumbling exhale. The dog pressed his heavy jaw firmer against Rowan's knee, bracing for the storm. The crushing, suffocating weight of the unvarnished truth settled over the narrow formica table, entirely displacing the heavy, grease-laden air of the diner. For a long, agonizing stretch of time, the only sound within the cramped booth was the desperate, ragged rhythm of the woman's breathing and the relentless, mechanical hum of the failing commercial refrigerator. Then, she moved. It was a slow, incredibly deliberate motion, completely devoid of the chaotic, terrified trembling that had consumed her fragile frame just moments prior. She reached her thin, pale right hand, deep inside the oversized, faded lapels of her olive-drab trench coat. Her papery fingers searched blindly along the heavy interior lining, pressing against a hidden, meticulously stitched seam near her hollow chest. The sharp, sudden sound of reinforced nylon threads violently giving way cut through the oppressive, dead silence. Rowan tilted his head slightly, his damaged auditory nerves locking instantly onto the precise, high-pitched frequency of ripping fabric. The muscles in his jaw hardened. Beneath the table, Dagger's dark, triangular ears rotated sharply forward. The sudden, distinct friction of the tearing seam released a concentrated, overwhelming burst of the exact, sterile scent the massive K9 had detected upon first entering the diner. The dry, bureaucratic aroma of damp archival paper, stale printer ink, and cold, sanitized metal flooded the cramped space, violently cutting through the lingering odor of burnt coffee. Her hand slowly emerged from the depths of the coat. Her fragile knuckles were bruised and completely bloodless from the sheer, desperate force of her grip. Slowly, agonizingly, she opened her trembling fingers over the center of the table. Resting in the deep, hollow palm of her hand was a small, heavy object. It was a tactical, encrypted, solid-state drive, entirely encased in a rugged shell of brushed titanium. The metal was deeply scuffed and worn smooth at the edges, carrying the distinct, heavy tarnish of being gripped tightly by sweating hands during countless, agonizingly sleepless nights. It was an artifact of immense, terrifying gravity. "They ordered me to purge the master servers," she whispered, her voice dropping into a hollow, haunting echo that barely reached Rowan's ears. They stood directly behind my chair in the communication hub. They watched the deletion progress bars reach 100%. They truly believed the entire digital footprint was eradicated. They did not know about the automated, physical backup protocol hardwired into the primary transmission terminal. She pressed two thin fingers against the cold titanium casing and slowly pushed the drive across the chipped formica. The heavy metal scraped against the cheap, cracked surface with a harsh, grating friction that vibrated directly into Rowan's chest. She stopped pushing when the drive rested exactly in the center of the table, directly in front of the blind veteran. "Every single audio file," she breathed out, her narrow chest shuddering violently beneath the trenchcoat. Every secure channel log. The exact, unalterable timestamp of your handler calling the frantic abort sequence. The commanding officer's verbal confirmation of the extraction denial. The classified coordinates of the unsanctioned weapons cache. It is all contained right here on this one single drive. I stole it. I ripped it from the terminal and sewed it into the lining of my uniform coat mere hours before I was processed for an honorable discharge, purchased with my permanent silence. Rowan Voss did not immediately reach for the object. He sat perfectly rigid, staring blindly into the hazy, muted gray shadows shifting across the table. That small, cold piece of metal held the entire, crushing weight of his destroyed life. It held the vindicated honor of his fallen brothers. It held the absolute, terrifying power to systematically dismantle a corrupt, entrenched network of military power that had traded the lives of loyal soldiers for illicit profit. Slowly, his left hand rose from the comforting, solid heat of Dagger's heavy skull. The battered leather glove reached across the vast, empty expanse of the table. His calloused, scarred fingers brushed against the freezing titanium. He closed his grip around the drive with absolute, terrifying finality. The jagged, worn edges of the metal pressed deeply, painfully into his palm through the thick leather. "I have carried this ghost for over a decade," the woman whispered, her hollow, dark eyes finally filling with a profound, exhausting, and monumental wave of relief. Her shoulders slumped, the invisible weight of her massive survivor's guilt finally transferring to the man across from her. "I cannot carry it one single step further. It belongs to you." Rowan withdrew his hand. He meticulously secured the heavy titanium drive deep within the interior chest pocket of his worn jacket. He felt the cold, hard weight of the metal settling directly over his steadily beating heart. He did not offer her empty words of absolution. He did not offer a grand declaration of forgiveness. The trauma they shared was far too deep, far too permanently scarring for such simple gestures. But as he sat in the suffocating silence of the diner, Rowan gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a silent, solemn acknowledgement of her unbearable burden and a grim, resolute acceptance of the massive war that was about to begin. Rowan Voss slowly pushed his heavy frame upward. The worn, cracked vinyl of the booth groaned one final time beneath his shifting weight, a harsh friction that scraped against the quieted air of the diner. He did not turn his head back toward the fragile, trembling figure remaining in the corner shadow. He did not offer a final nod or a hollow word of parting. The transaction of agonizing truth was complete. The crushing, suffocating gravity that had anchored the woman to that Formica table for over a decade had been entirely transferred into the deep chest pocket of Rowan's jacket. The titanium drive rested there, a freezing, unyielding block of metal pressing rhythmically against his beating heart. He adjusted his grip on the thick leather leash. His left hand, still encased in the battered glove, no longer squeezed the heavy loop with a desperate, white-knuckled panic. The tension was gone. The frantic, erratic electric current of pure survival instinct had drained away, replaced by a cold, heavy, and absolute resolve. "Let us go," Rowan murmured. The gravel in his voice was low, vibrating deep within his chest, entirely devoid of the violent tremor that had gripped him mere minutes before. Beneath the table, Dagger responded instantly. The massive Belgian Malinois slid out from the cramped space, his heavy claws clicking with a steady, rhythmic purpose against the peeling linoleum floor. The coarse hair along the ridge of his spine lay perfectly flat. The deep, defensive hum that had rattled within his broad rib cage had completely evaporated. As they moved down the narrow aisle, navigating the muted, hazy gray shadows of the diner, a profound, physical shift occurred in the dog's rigid architecture. For years, Dagger had moved through civilian spaces with his massive body angled in a permanent, tactical defense. He had always favored his left side, instinctually pulling his scarred flank away from open spaces, hiding his deepest vulnerability from a world he no longer trusted. But as they walked toward the heavy glass exit doors, the dog's alignment changed. He did not press his left shoulder against the booths. He did not shrink away from the open aisle. Dagger walked squarely, his broad chest leading the way, his powerful legs driving into the floorboards with an ancient, undeniable confidence. The jagged, pale canyon of scar tissue on his left flank was exposed to the harsh, flickering overhead light, but he carried it no longer as a mark of catastrophic failure. He carried it like a heavily forged shield. The ghost that had hunted them through their nightmares had finally been dragged into the light, and it was no longer a predator. It was simply a fragile, broken woman who had handed them the weapon they needed. Rowan pushed his shoulder against the heavy glass door. It gave way. The immediate, violent blast of the midnight highway wind struck them both. It was freezing, carrying the sharp, bitter scent of asphalt, diesel exhaust, and endless miles of empty road. The sudden drop in temperature slapped against Rowan's face, instantly chilling the cold sweat that had pooled at his temples. It rushed into his lungs, purging the thick, grease-laden air of the diner, filling his chest with a sharp, stinging clarity. Dagger stepped out onto the cracked concrete of the parking lot. The massive dog lifted his dark muzzle into the freezing gale. He did not shiver. He did not lower his ears against the biting chill. He stood beside his handler, leaning his heavy, solid frame firmly against Rowan's left leg. They stood together at the very edge of the black asphalt, facing the vast, echoing emptiness of the highway. They were no longer running. The relentless, agonizing marathon of escaping their own shattered history had abruptly ended inside that roadside diner. The cold, heavy titanium drive resting against Rowan's heart was not merely an archive of betrayal. It was an absolute declaration of war. Rowan tightened his grip on the leather leash, staring blindly into the roaring wind. They had entered the diner as casualties of a forgotten betrayal. They were walking out into the dark as hunters, and they finally had their target. The journey of Rowan Voss and his scarred Belgian Malinois is not simply a tale of battlefield survival. It is a profound, unflinching testament to the enduring battle for truth in the agonizing aftermath of service. True warfare often begins long after the final shot is fired, fought in the quiet, suffocating halls of bureaucracy, where the undeniable rights of veterans are too easily buried beneath classified paperwork and systemic silence. The catastrophic betrayal Rowan and Dagger faced in the desert was not just a tragic failure of communication. It was a deliberate, calculated violation of the sacred pact a nation makes with its soldiers. Their story highlights a devastating reality. The vast administrative systems designed to protect our servicemen, to secure their welfare and honor their profound sacrifices, can sometimes become the very mechanisms of their destruction. Yet, within this overwhelming darkness, we find the absolute, unbreakable power of loyalty. It is not just the physical loyalty of a traumatized canine standing as a living shield for his blind handler. It is the agonizing, moral loyalty of a shattered communication officer who carried a freezing titanium drive for over 10 years, sacrificing her own peace to protect the ghosts of the fallen. True healing, they teach us, does not come from obediently forgetting. It comes from violently dragging the truth out of the shadows. It comes from relentlessly demanding the justice, the social recognition, and the dignity that every single veteran has rightfully earned through their blood. As the heavy diner doors closed and Rowan stepped into the freezing midnight wind with Dagger walking squarely by his side, they were no longer the silent victims of a forgotten tragedy. They became the relentless, breathing pursuit of absolute accountability. This chapter reminds us that true courage is often devastatingly quiet. It is the trembling, papery hand passing a hidden drive across a chipped Formica table. It is a massive, scarred K9 learning to walk without fear, turning his deepest wound into a shield. It is a blinded veteran refusing to surrender his honor to a corrupt command. To everyone watching, especially those who have worn the uniform or loved someone who has, your silent sacrifices are seen. Your exhausting struggles for the rights, the care, and the recognition you deserve are never fought in total darkness, even when the system deliberately tries to close its eyes to your pain. The truth, no matter how deeply buried beneath bureaucratic lies, always leaves a trail for those brave enough to track it. Thank you for walking this incredible emotional journey with kindness and K9 legends. We want to hear from you. Have you or someone you deeply love ever had to fight a massive, unyielding system to uncover the truth or claim the honor that was rightfully earned? Share your profound stories in the comments below. Let us build a formidable community where no veteran ever has to walk into the freezing wind alone. Hit the subscribe button, share this message of resilience, and stay tuned for the next chapter of their hunt for justice.